David Carter, a billionaire from Chicago, sat behind the wheel of his luxurious car, cruising down a deserted road. The leather seat creaked as he shifted, his mind wandering to the countless business meetings and extravagant parties that had filled his life over the past few years. The soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt provided a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of his bustling corporate world. As he drove, his phone rang. The car's sophisticated infotainment system displayed the caller ID, Claire, his wife. David hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Claire," he said, his voice betraying a hint of weariness. Claire's voice crackled through the speakers, tinged with frustration. "David, where are you? You missed dinner again. The kids were asking about you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. David sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm sorry, Claire. The meeting ran late, and I had to finalize some details for the merger. I'll make it up to you and the kids this weekend. I promise." "That's what you always say, David," Claire replied, her tone a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "We barely see you anymore. It's like you're a stranger in your own home." The conversation continued, with Claire expressing her growing dissatisfaction with their marriage. David listened, offering weak excuses and hollow promises, all too aware of the widening gulf between them. As the call ended, he felt a pang of guilt, realizing how much he had neglected his family in pursuit of his business empire. Lost in thought, David barely noticed as the road became increasingly desolate and somber. The streetlights grew sparse, casting long shadows across the pavement. His mind replayed snippets of arguments with Claire, missed recitals and game nights with the kids, and the growing sense of emptiness that plagued him despite his immense wealth. The road curved sharply, cutting through a dense forest. David's thoughts drifted to the last family vacation they had taken years ago. He remembered the laughter, the genuine smiles, the feeling of connection that now seemed so distant. How had he let things deteriorate so much? Suddenly, a flash of movement caught David's eye. A deer bounded onto the road, its eyes wide with fear as it froze in the glare of the headlights. David's instincts kicked in, and he jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, attempting to avoid the animal. Time seemed to slow as the car careened off the road. David felt a surge of adrenaline as he fought to regain control, but it was too late. The vehicle skidded on the loose gravel, spinning wildly before slamming into a large oak tree. The impact was devastating. The airbags deployed with a deafening bang, and the sound of crunching metal filled the air. Shattered glass rained down on David as his head whipped forward, then back. In those final moments of consciousness, a strange sense of calm washed over him. As darkness closed in, his last fleeting thought was of his family, and the realization that he might never see them again. The once pristine luxury car now lay crumpled against the tree, its horn blaring into the night. David slumped forward, unconscious and bleeding, as the forest around him fell silent. The lonely road stretched out before and behind the wreckage, with no signs of other travelers or help in sight. As the minutes ticked by, the severity of David's situation became apparent. His phone, thrown from its holder during the crash, lay just out of reach, its screen cracked, but still displaying Claire's worried text messages. The irony of the situation was palpable. The man who had everything was now alone and helpless, his fate hanging in the balance on this deserted stretch of road. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled David's nostrils as he slowly regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. Confusion washed over him as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. White walls, beeping machines, and the steady drip of an IV, all unfamiliar and unsettling. A doctor in a white coat approached his bedside, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Carter, you're awake," are you feeling?" The doctor's words were clear, but their meaning seemed to float just out of David's grasp. David opened his mouth to speak, but his voice came out as a raspy whisper. Where am I? What happened?" He looked around the room, searching for something, anything familiar, but found nothing. The doctor's expression softened. "You were in a car accident, Mr. Carter. You've been unconscious for several days. Can you tell me what you remember?" David furrowed his brow, trying to access memories that simply weren't there. Panic began to set in as he realized he couldn't recall anything. Not the accident, not his life before it, not even his own name. I don't know. I can't remember anything." Over the next few hours, a parade of medical professionals came and went, running tests and asking questions that David couldn't answer. The diagnosis was clear: retrograde amnesia, likely caused by the head trauma from the accident. The doctors assured him that his memories might return in time, but they couldn't say when or if it would happen. As the days passed and David's physical injuries began to heal, the emotional toll of his memory loss became increasingly apparent. He waited anxiously for visitors, for someone to come and claim him, to fill in the blanks of his life. But no one came. The day of his discharge arrived, and David found himself standing outside the hospital, a small bag of belongings in hand, feeling more lost than ever. A nurse had helped him access his wallet, which contained ID and credit cards, but these felt like artifacts from someone else's life. David hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address listed on his ID. As they drove through the streets of Chicago, he pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the city pass by without recognition. The taxi pulled up to an imposing mansion, and David paid the fare with a credit card that felt foreign in his hands. He approached the front door with trepidation, ringing the bell. After a long moment, a uniformed maid answered. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Carter, we weren't expecting you." David stepped inside, feeling like an intruder in what was supposed to be his own home. "Is my family here?" he asked hesitantly. The maid looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Carter is out of town on business, sir. The children are at boarding school." The vast, empty house echoed with David's footsteps as he wandered from room to room. Expensive artwork adorned the walls, and designer furniture filled the spaces, but none of it sparked any recognition or emotional connection. Family photos on the mantel showed smiling faces that should have been familiar, but felt like strangers. Days passed, and still no word from his family. David tried calling the numbers listed in his phone, but they went straight to voicemail. Emails and text messages went unanswered. The stark reality began to set in. His family, whoever they were, didn't seem concerned about his disappearance or well-being. Overwhelmed by the loneliness and disconnect he felt in the grand house, David made a decision. He packed a small bag with clothes and essentials, withdrew some cash from his account, and walked out the front door. The bustling streets of Chicago surrounded him as he wandered aimlessly, feeling lost in every sense of the word. The towering skyscrapers and busy intersections offered no comfort or familiarity. People rushed by, absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the man who had lost everything, including himself. As night fell, David found himself in a park, sitting on a bench, watching families and couples enjoy the evening. The laughter of children and the gentle conversations of passers-by only served to highlight his isolation. He was a man without a past, without connections, adrift in a city that should have been his home but felt entirely alien. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, David realized he was truly on his own. The man who once had everything now had nothing but the clothes on his back and the gnawing emptiness of a life he couldn't remember. As he contemplated his next move, one question echoed in his mind. Who was David Carter, and what would he become now that his slate had been wiped clean? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park. David's stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since leaving the hospital. He stood up from the bench, his joints stiff from sitting for hours, and began to wander through the park, hoping to find a food vendor or a cafe nearby. Instead, he stumbled upon a group of people gathered near a cluster of picnic tables. They were an eclectic bunch, ranging in age from their 40s to 60s, dressed in a mix of casual wear and what looked like second-hand business attire. Their laughter and animated conversation drifted toward David, a stark contrast to the loneliness he'd been feeling. As he approached, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes noticed him. "Hey there," she called out. "You look a little lost. Care to join us?" David hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I am a bit lost, actually." The woman introduced herself as Lisa and gestured for David to sit. A man named Tom offered him a paper plate with a sandwich and some chips. "It's not much," Tom said with a shrug, "but we're happy to share." As David ate, he listened to the group's conversation. They spoke of past careers in finance, marketing, and technology, lives that seemed to parallel what little he knew of his own background. But there was something different about them, a warmth and camaraderie that felt foreign, yet inviting. Lisa, noticing David's quiet demeanor, turned to him. "So, what's your story?" she asked gently. David swallowed hard, unsure of how much to reveal. I'm not really sure," he admitted. "I was in an accident, and I can't remember anything about my life before waking up in the hospital." The group fell silent for a moment, exchanging glances. Then Lisa spoke up again, her voice filled with empathy. "That must be terrifying," she said. "But you know what? Maybe it's also an opportunity." Intrigued, David leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Lisa smiled sadly. "Well, let me tell you my story. I used to be a high-powered executive at a major corporation. I had everything: money, status, power. But I was also involved in some less than ethical practices. When it all came crashing down in a big scandal, I lost everything: my job, my savings, my reputation." The others in the group nodded, murmuring in agreement. Tom chimed in. "Most of us here have similar stories. We were so caught up in the rat race in accumulating wealth and power that we lost sight of what really matters." As David listened to their stories, he felt a strange sense of connection. Though he couldn't remember his own past, something about their experiences resonated with him. He found himself opening up, sharing the confusion and fear he'd been feeling since waking up in the hospital. The group listened attentively, offering words of support and understanding. For the first time since his accident, David felt a sense of belonging. These people, who had lost so much themselves, were offering him something priceless: acceptance and companionship. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted from past regrets to present joys. Lisa spoke about the volunteer work she did at a local shelter. Tom shared funny stories about the odd jobs he'd taken to make ends meet. Others chimed in with tales of rediscovering hobbies, reconnecting with family, or finding purpose in helping others. David found himself laughing along with them, the weight of his amnesia temporarily lifting. He realized that despite their hardships, these people had found a way to rebuild their lives, focusing on what truly mattered. As the group began to disperse for the night, Lisa turned to David. "Look," she said, "I know you're going through something unimaginable right now, but if you want, you're welcome to hang out with us again. We meet here every evening, same time, same place." David nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say. "I'd like that." As he watched the group leave, waving goodbye to his new acquaintances, David felt a glimmer of hope. He may have lost his memories, his identity, and his old life, but perhaps he had stumbled upon something even more valuable: a chance to start anew, guided by people who understood the importance of second chances and simple joys. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, David didn't feel entirely lost. He had found a group of people who accepted him as he was, without expectations or judgments based on his past. As he searched for a place to spend the night, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's meeting, eager to learn more about his new friends and, perhaps, about himself. Over the next few weeks, David fell into a routine with his new group of friends. They met regularly at the park, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. As he spent more time with them, he began to notice the sorry state of the park they frequented: overgrown grass, broken benches, and a general air of neglect. One evening, as they sat around their usual picnic table, David spoke up. "You know, I've been thinking, this park has become important to us, but it's in pretty bad shape. What if we did something about it?" The group looked at him with interest. Tom leaned forward. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," David continued, feeling a surge of enthusiasm, "what if we restored it? Clean it up, fix the benches, maybe even plant some flowers. We could make it a place the whole community could enjoy." Lisa's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, David, but it would take a lot of work and resources. How would we manage it?" As David began to outline his thoughts, he felt a familiar sense of excitement. Words flowed easily as he discussed logistics, potential challenges, and solutions. The group listened attentively, adding their own ideas and suggestions. "We could start small," David explained, sketching out a rough plan on a napkin. "Begin with basic cleanup, then move on to repairs. We might be able to get donations from local businesses for supplies." As he spoke, David felt a strange sensation, like muscle memory kicking in. He realized he was tapping into skills he must have honed in his previous life: leadership, project management, problem solving. It was both exhilarating and unsettling. The group enthusiastically agreed to the plan, and over the next few days, they began the work of restoring the park. David found himself naturally taking on a leadership role, coordinating efforts and motivating the team. As they worked, sweating under the summer sun, David experienced occasional flashes of memory. Brief images of boardrooms and business meetings flickered through his mind. He saw himself standing at the head of a table, presenting to a group of suit-clad executives. These glimpses were frustratingly brief, disappearing as quickly as they came, leaving David with a sense of disconnect between his past and present selves. One afternoon, as David was helping Tom repair a broken swing set, a particularly vivid memory surfaced. He saw himself in a heated argument with a woman, Claire, his wife. Her words echoed in his mind. "You're never here, David. You're married to your work, not to me." The force of the memory made David stumble, nearly dropping the tools he was holding. Tom noticed his distress. "You okay there, buddy?" David shook his head to clear it. "Yeah, I think so. Just remembering something, I guess." Tom nodded understandingly. "Anything you want to talk about?" David hesitated, then began to share the fragments of memory that had been surfacing. As he spoke, he felt a growing unease. The person he was remembering, the driven, work-obsessed executive, seemed at odds with the man he had become since the accident. "I'm not sure I like the person I'm remembering," David admitted quietly. Tom placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Look, David, we've all got pasts we're not proud of. What matters is who you choose to be now." As the park restoration project progressed, David found himself grappling with these conflicting identities. The skills from his past life proved invaluable in organizing the project, but the values he was developing, community, friendship, the joy of simple work, felt more authentic and fulfilling. One evening, as the group sat admiring their progress, Lisa raised an important question. "David, have you thought about trying to reconnect with your old life? Your family must be worried about you." The question hit David like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on the present, on the park project and his new friends, that he had pushed thoughts of his past life aside. Now, faced with the possibility of returning to that life, he felt a surge of anxiety. I'm not sure," he admitted. "The more I remember, the more I realize how unhappy I was. But I can't just abandon my responsibilities, can I?" The group fell into a thoughtful silence. Finally, Tom spoke up. "You know, David, sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is to take care of yourself, to become the kind of person you want to be." As the sun set over the partially restored park, David found himself at a crossroads. The person he was remembering seemed successful by societal standards, but empty inside. The person he was becoming felt more alive, more connected, more purposeful. As he looked around at his new friends, at the tangible results of their work in the park, David began to question what true success really meant. Was it the corner office and the hefty bank account? Or was it the ability to make a real difference, to form genuine connections, to find joy in simple things? The park project was forcing David to confront these questions, to reevaluate his priorities and values. As his memories slowly returned, he realized that this project wasn't just about restoring a park. It was about restoring himself, about rediscovering what truly mattered in life. As the park restoration project gained momentum, it began to attract attention from the local community. Passers-by would stop to inquire about their work, often staying to lend a hand. The group's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon, what had started as a small effort by a handful of ex-executives had blossomed into a community-wide initiative. David, energized by the growing support, proposed an idea to the group one evening. "What if we organized a fundraising event?" he suggested. "We could showcase the work we've done so far and raise money to complete the restoration. Maybe even start similar projects in other neglected areas of the city." The group met his proposal with excitement. Lisa, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm, added, "We could make it a real community celebration. Food, music, games for the kids. Show everyone what's possible when people come together." Over the next few weeks, David threw himself into organizing the event. He found himself drawing on skills he didn't realize he possessed, negotiating with local businesses for donations, coordinating volunteers, and even speaking to local media outlets about the project. Each task felt both familiar and new, as if he were rediscovering parts of himself he had forgotten. As the day of the event approached, David's excitement was tinged with a growing sense of unease. The increasing media attention meant that news of the project and of David's involvement was spreading. He couldn't shake the feeling that his past life was catching up to him. On the morning of the event, David arrived at the park early to oversee the final preparations. The transformation was remarkable. Once broken benches now stood sturdy and freshly painted. New playground equipment gleamed in the morning sun. Flower beds bursting with color lined the winding paths. As volunteers bustled about, setting up booths and hanging decorations, a local news van pulled up. A reporter and cameraman approached David, microphone in hand. "Mr. Carter," the reporter began, "we'd love to get a statement about this amazing project you've spearheaded." David felt a jolt of recognition at the use of his last name. He hadn't told anyone in the group his full name, preferring to be known simply as David. As he fumbled for a response, he caught sight of a familiar face in the gathering crowd, Claire, his wife. Their eyes met across the busy park, and David felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Claire looked as elegant and put together as ever, but there was something different in her expression, a mix of relief, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite place. As Claire made her way towards him, David excused himself from the reporter and moved to meet her. They stood face to face, the noise of the gathering crowd fading into the background. David, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. We've been looking everywhere for you. What happened? Why didn't you come home? David struggled to find the right words. How could he explain the journey he'd been on, the changes he'd undergone? I'm sorry, Claire, he began. After the accident, I couldn't remember anything. And when I started to, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to the life I had. Claire's expression hardened. What do you mean? We had everything, David. The company needs you. I need you. As they talked, David felt the weight of his old life pressing down on him. Claire spoke of board meetings and corporate responsibilities, of social obligations and maintaining their status, but all David could think about was the joy he'd found in simple work, in genuine friendships, in making a tangible difference in people's lives. Their conversation was interrupted by Tom, who approached with a concerned look. Everything okay here, David? He asked, eyeing Claire warily. David introduced them, watching as two parts of his life collided. The contrast between Claire's polished exterior and Tom's worn but friendly demeanor couldn't have been starker. As the event got underway, David found himself torn between two worlds. He gave speeches, shook hands, and accepted congratulations, all while grappling with the question of where he truly belonged. Claire remained at the periphery, a constant reminder of the life he'd left behind. The fundraiser was a resounding success. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the revitalized park, David stood on the makeshift stage to deliver a final speech, looking out over the crowd, his new friends, the community members who'd supported them, and Claire standing at the back. He felt a surge of emotion. When we started this project, he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. I didn't know who I was or where I belonged. But through this work, through the connections we've made and the change we've created together, I've discovered something important. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or status. It's measured in the impact we have on others, in the strength of our communities, in the joy we find in simple acts of kindness and creation. As he spoke, David realized he was not just addressing the crowd, but also himself. He was standing at a crossroads, faced with a decision that would shape the rest of his life. The man he had been and the man he had become were at odds, and he knew he couldn't go back to his old life unchanged. As the speech ended and applause filled the air, David's eyes met Claire's. In that moment, he saw a flicker of understanding in her expression, a recognition of the profound change he had undergone. The decision he faced wasn't just about choosing between two lifestyles. It was about being true to the person he had become, the values he now held dear. The successful fundraiser marked not just a triumph for the park project, but a turning point in David's journey of self-discovery. As the event wound down and the future loomed uncertain, he knew that whatever path he chose, he would never be the same man who had driven down that lonely road so many weeks ago. As the crowd began to disperse and the cleanup efforts started, David found himself approached by Claire once again. Her earlier composure had given way to a mix of emotions, confusion, frustration, and a hint of desperation. David, she began, her voice low and urgent. We need to talk, properly. Can we go somewhere private? David nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He led Claire to a quiet corner of the park, away from the bustle of the departing attendees and volunteers. They sat on one of the newly refurbished benches, the fruits of David's labor a stark contrast to the tension between them. Claire spoke first, her words tumbling out in a rush. I don't understand, David. Why didn't you come home? Do you have any idea what we've been through? The company is in chaos. The board is asking questions, and the children... She trailed off, her voice catching. David took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Claire, I'm sorry for the pain I've caused you and the kids, but you have to understand, when I woke up in that hospital, I didn't remember anything. And as my memory started to come back, I realized something important. I wasn't happy in our life. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. Not happy? David, we had everything. The house, the cars, the vacations. How could you not be happy? That's just it, David replied, gesturing around the park. All of those things, they didn't mean anything. Here, doing this work, I found something real. I've made genuine connections with people. I've made a tangible difference in people's lives. Can you remember the last time I was able to say that about my work at the company? Claire fell silent, her gaze dropping to her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with a vulnerability David couldn't remember hearing before. I know things weren't perfect between us, David, but I thought we were building something together, a legacy for our children. Was it all a lie? David reached out, gently taking Claire's hand. No, it wasn't a lie. We did build something, but somewhere along the way, we lost sight of what really matters. When was the last time we had dinner as a family without checking our phones? When did we last take a vacation that wasn't interrupted by work calls? As they talked, David found himself opening up about the journey he'd been on. The fear and confusion of his amnesia, the kindness of the strangers who became friends, and the profound shift in his perspective that came from working on the park project. Claire listened, her expression softening as David spoke. I had no idea you felt this way, she said quietly. I guess I've been so caught up in our lifestyle that I didn't see how unhappy you were, how unhappy we both were. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Claire made a surprising proposition. Come home, David, she said, a new determination in her voice. Not to go back to how things were, but to figure out how things could be. We can make changes, find a better balance. The kids miss you, and I miss you too. David felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The prospect of reuniting with his family pulled at his heart, but he couldn't shake the fear of falling back into old patterns. I don't know, Claire, he said hesitantly. I'm not the same person I was before. I'm not sure I can go back to that life. Then don't, Claire replied, surprising David with her directness. Bring this new you home. Help us understand what you've learned. Maybe we all need a change. As they continued to talk, working through years of unspoken feelings and misunderstandings, the park around them buzzed with activity. Volunteers were putting the finishing touches on the day's work, their laughter and chatter a testament to the community spirit David had helped foster. Tom approached, concern evident on his face as he saw David deep in conversation with Claire. Everything okay here? He asked, his protective nature showing through. David nodded, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. Yes, Tom. This is Claire, my wife. We're just figuring things out. Tom's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he quickly composed himself. Well, when you're ready, we're all gathering to celebrate. You're the man of the hour, after all. As Tom walked away, David felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. On one side was the life he'd built over the past weeks. Simple, meaningful, filled with genuine connections. On the other was his family, the possibility of redemption, of bringing the lessons he'd learned into his old life and transforming it from within. Claire squeezed his hand gently. You don't have to decide everything right now, David. But please, just come home. Let's talk more. Let's figure this out together. As the evening wore on and the celebration of the park's transformation reached its peak, David found himself at the center of it all, torn between two worlds. The man he had been and the man he had become stood at a crossroads, each path offering its own promises and challenges. The decision loomed, as complex and nuanced as the journey that had brought him to this moment. As he looked from Claire to his new friends, From the revitalized park to the glittering city skyline in the distance, David knew that whatever choice he made would set the course for the next chapter of his life. A chapter he never could have imagined when he first woke up in that hospital bed, lost and alone. As the celebration continued around him, David found himself at the center of attention. Community members, volunteers, and even local officials approached to congratulate him on the success of the park restoration project. Each handshake and word of praise filled David with a sense of accomplishment, but also deepened his internal conflict. Lisa made her way through the crowd, her face beaming with pride. "David," she said, pulling him into a warm hug, "you've done something truly remarkable here. You've brought this community together in a way I've never seen before." David smiled, touched by her words. "We all did this together, Lisa. I couldn't have done any of it without you and the others." As Lisa stepped back, she noticed Claire standing nearby, watching the interaction with a mix of curiosity and unease. Lisa's expression shifted, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You must be David's wife," she said, extending her hand to Claire. "I'm Lisa. David's told us—" "Well, not much actually, but it's nice to meet you." Claire shook Lisa's hand, her polite smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It's nice to meet you, too. I'm still trying to understand everything that's happened here." As the three of them stood together, the contrast between David's two worlds became even more apparent. Lisa, with her worn jeans and paint-stained t-shirt, embodied the simple, purposeful life David had embraced over the past weeks. Claire, in her designer dress and perfectly styled hair, represented the world of wealth and status he had left behind. The moment was interrupted by a local reporter who had been covering the event. "Mr. Carter," she said, approaching with a microphone and cameraman in tow, "your story is fascinating. A successful businessman who disappeared after an accident, only to resurface, leading a community restoration project. Our viewers would love to hear more about your journey." David felt a surge of panic. He hadn't considered how his story might be perceived by the wider world. He glanced at Claire, seeing the tension in her posture, then at Lisa, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, David decided to embrace the truth. "It's been an incredible journey," he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Losing my memory was terrifying, but it also gave me a unique opportunity. It allowed me to see the world and myself with fresh eyes." As David continued, describing the kindness of strangers and the fulfillment he'd found in community service, he could see the reporter hanging on every word. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Claire's expression softening, a look of understanding slowly replacing her earlier confusion. "What I've learned," David concluded, "is that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or stock options. It's measured in the connections we make, the positive impact we have on others' lives, and the sense of purpose we find in our work." As the reporter thanked him and moved away, David found himself surrounded by his group of ex-executive friends. Tom clapped him on the back, his face split by a wide grin. "Well said, David. You've got a real gift for inspiring people." The group huddled together, their bond evident in their easy laughter and comfortable body language. Claire stood slightly apart, observing the interaction with a mixture of emotions playing across her face. In a quiet moment, Claire pulled David aside. "I had no idea," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Watching you with these people, seeing what you've accomplished here, I'm beginning to understand why you couldn't just come home." David nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It's not that I didn't want to come home, Claire. It's that I needed to figure out who I really am, what really matters to me." As they talked, David could see Claire wrestling with her own realizations. "I've been so focused on maintaining our lifestyle, on meeting everyone's expectations," she admitted. "I never stopped to question whether it was making us happy." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a man in an expensive suit, his face a mask of barely contained anger. David recognized him as Robert, his former colleague and a member of the company's board of directors. "David," Robert said, his tone clipped, "what the hell do you think you're doing? Do you have any idea what your disappearance has done to the company, to our stock prices?" The sudden intrusion of his old world jolted David. He straightened up, feeling a familiar mantle of authority settle over him. "Robert," he replied calmly, "I understand you're upset, but I hope you can see that there are more important things than stock prices." Robert's face reddened. "More important? We're talking about billions of dollars, thousands of jobs. You have a responsibility to the company, to the shareholders." As Robert continued his tirade, David found himself at a crossroads. The old David might have been cowed by Robert's arguments, might have felt the weight of those responsibilities pulling him back into his former life. But the new David, the one who had found purpose in simple work and genuine connections, stood firm. "You're right, Robert," David said, his voice steady and clear. "I do have responsibilities, to my family, to my community, and to myself, and I'm finally learning how to fulfill them." As Robert sputtered in disbelief, David turned to Claire, seeing a new light in her eyes. He then looked at his group of friends, who stood nearby, offering silent support. In that moment, surrounded by the tangible results of their work in the park, David felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The man he had been and the man he had become were no longer at war. Instead, they were merging, creating someone new, someone who understood the value of both worlds and could bridge the gap between them. As the sun set on the transformed park, David realized that his journey of rediscovery was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the confrontation with Robert subsided, David found himself in the eye of an emotional storm. The park, once filled with celebration, now hummed with tension. His two worlds had collided spectacularly, leaving him to navigate the aftermath. Claire, who had witnessed the exchange with Robert, approached David with a newfound respect in her eyes. "I've never seen you stand up to the board like that before," she said softly. "You've really changed, haven't you?" David nodded, feeling both exhilarated and exhausted. "I suppose I have," he replied. "I'm just starting to understand how much." As the evening wore on, David found himself pulled in multiple directions. His new friends wanted to celebrate their success, while Claire was eager to continue their conversation about the future. Meanwhile, Robert's presence served as a constant reminder of the corporate world he'd left behind. Feeling overwhelmed, David excused himself from the group and wandered to a quiet corner of the park. He sat on a bench overlooking a small pond they had cleaned and restored. The water reflected the soft glow of the newly installed lights, creating a peaceful oasis amidst the chaos of his thoughts. As he sat there, trying to make sense of his conflicting emotions, David was joined by Lisa and Tom. They sat on either side of him, offering silent support. After a few moments, Lisa spoke. "You know, when we first met you, we had no idea who you really were. But watching you tonight, seeing you with your wife and dealing with that angry businessman, it's clear you're not just some regular Joe who lost his memory." Tom nodded in agreement. "You've got a foot in two very different worlds, David. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like both of them need you." David sighed heavily. "I don't know how to reconcile them," he admitted. "The corporate world, my old life, it all feels so empty now. But I can't just abandon my family, my responsibilities." "Maybe you don't have to choose," Lisa suggested. "Maybe there's a way to bring the lessons you've learned here back into your old life." As they talked, David found himself opening up about his fears and doubts. He shared the sense of purpose he'd found in their work, the joy of making a tangible difference in people's lives. But he also spoke of his love for his family and the nagging sense of duty he felt towards the company he'd helped build. Tom and Lisa listened attentively, offering perspective from their own experiences of leaving the corporate world behind. Their wisdom and support helped David see his situation in a new light. As their conversation drew to a close, David felt a sense of clarity beginning to emerge. He realized that his journey wasn't about choosing between two worlds, but about finding a way to integrate the best aspects of both. With renewed purpose, David rejoined the main group. He found Claire deep in conversation with some of the community members, her initial discomfort replaced by genuine interest in their stories. Seeing David approach, Claire excused herself and met him halfway. "I think I'm beginning to understand," she said, taking his hand. "This work, these people, they've given you something that was missing in our life." David nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. "It's not just about the work, Claire. It's about connection, about making a real difference. I don't want to lose that." Claire squeezed his hand. "Then don't," she said firmly. "Bring it home with you. Help me understand. Help our children understand. Maybe it's time for all of us to reevaluate what's truly important." As they stood there, surrounded by the fruits of David's labor and the community he'd helped build, a plan began to form in David's mind. It wouldn't be easy, and it would require significant changes to their lifestyle. But for the first time since waking up in the hospital, he felt truly hopeful about the future. The evening was drawing to a close, and David knew he had to make a decision. He gathered his group of friends, along with Claire, and addressed them all. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "You took in a stranger with no memory and showed him the true meaning of friendship and community. I've learned more from you all in these past weeks than I had in years of boardroom meetings." He paused, looking at each face in turn. "But I've also realized that I can't run away from my past. I have a family, responsibilities, and a unique position that allows me to make a difference on a larger scale." David took a deep breath before continuing. "I've decided to go home with Claire, but this isn't goodbye. The work we've done here, the connections we've made, they're too important to leave behind. I want to find a way to bridge these two worlds, to bring the spirit of what we've accomplished here into my old life." The group responded with a mixture of emotions: happiness for David's reconciliation with his family, sadness at the thought of his departure, and curiosity about what this new chapter might bring. As the night drew to a close and goodbyes were said, David felt a complex mix of emotions. He was embarking on a new journey, one that would challenge him to maintain the authenticity and purpose he'd discovered, while navigating the complexities of his old life. Hand in hand with Claire, David took one last look at the transformed park. It stood as a testament to the power of community, to the importance of purpose, and to his own capacity for change. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he was no longer the same man who had driven down that lonely road so many weeks ago. He was someone new, someone who understood the true meaning of wealth and success. As they walked away, David felt both the weight of his decision and the lightness of possibility. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was excited to face it head-on. The following days were a whirlwind of activity and emotion for David. Returning home with Claire felt like stepping into a familiar yet foreign world. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of his success, now seemed oversized and empty. Family photos on the walls told the story of a life he was struggling to fully reclaim. As David reacquainted himself with his old life, he found himself constantly comparing it to the simplicity and purpose he'd found during his time away. The contrast was stark, often leaving him feeling conflicted and out of place. Claire, true to her word, was supportive of David's desire for change. She listened intently as he shared stories of his experiences, his eyes lighting up as he described the sense of community and accomplishment he'd found in the park project. One evening, as they sat in the garden, Claire broached a subject they'd been dancing around. "David," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what you said about making changes. I think I'd like to try living more simply, to focus on what really matters." David felt a surge of hope at her words. "Really? You'd be willing to do that?" Claire nodded, a mix of determination and uncertainty in her eyes. "I saw how happy you were, how fulfilled. I want that for us, for our family. It won't be easy, but I think it's worth trying." Over the next few weeks, David and Claire began the process of simplifying their lives. They donated excess belongings, scaled back on unnecessary expenses, and made plans to move to a smaller, more modest home. Each decision was a step towards aligning their lifestyle with their newfound values. However, not everything was smooth sailing. David's return to the corporate world was met with mixed reactions. Some colleagues welcomed him back with open arms, while others, like Robert, remained skeptical of his changed perspective. In his first board meeting since his return, David found himself at odds with the prevailing mindset. As discussions revolved around cost-cutting measures and profit margins, he couldn't help but think of the community he'd left behind and the real-world impact of their decisions. Taking a deep breath, David stood up, commanding the attention of the room. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I think we're missing the bigger picture here. Our focus on short-term profits is blinding us to the potential for meaningful, sustainable growth." He went on to propose a radical shift in the company's approach, advocating for increased investment in community development projects and ethical business practices. His impassioned speech was met with a mix of intrigue and skepticism from the board members. As the days passed, David worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between his two worlds. He maintained regular contact with Lisa, Tom, and the others, often seeking their advice as he navigated the challenges of implementing change in the corporate world. One sunny afternoon, David decided to take a walk in the park where his journey of self-discovery had begun. As he sat on a bench, watching families enjoy the renovated space, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The park stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when people came together with a shared purpose. Lost in thought, David almost didn't notice when Tom sat down beside him. "Penny for your thoughts?" Tom asked, a knowing smile on his face. David chuckled, grateful for the familiar presence. "Just reflecting on how much has changed, and how much still needs to change." Tom nodded understandingly. "Change isn't easy, especially when you're trying to change an entire system. But from what I've heard, you're making waves." They fell into an easy conversation, with David sharing his struggles and small victories in trying to implement a more community-focused approach in his company. Tom listened attentively, offering insights from his own experience. As their talk wound down, Tom turned to David with a serious expression. "You know what you're trying to do, bringing the spirit of community and social responsibility into the corporate world. It's important work. Don't let the naysayers discourage you." David felt a renewed sense of purpose at Tom's words. "Thanks, Tom. Sometimes I wonder if I'm fighting a losing battle, but then I remember what we accomplished here." He gestured to the park around them. "And I know it's worth the effort." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, David stood up, ready to head home. He felt a strange mix of nostalgia for the simpler life he'd led here, and excitement for the challenges ahead. Walking back to his car, David's phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Don't forget, we're meeting with the realtor tomorrow about that house in the suburbs." A smile spread across David's face. It wasn't just his professional life that was changing. His personal life was transforming too. The journey ahead would be challenging, but as he looked back at the park one last time, David felt ready to face whatever came next. He was no longer torn between two worlds. Instead, he was forging a new path, one that integrated the best aspects of both, It wouldn't be easy, but David was committed to living a life of purpose, to making a real difference in the world, whether that was in a boardroom or a community park. As he drove home, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't have all the answers, but he had a clear vision of the man he wanted to be and the impact he wanted to make. And for now, that was enough. Several months had passed since David's return to his old life, and the changes he had implemented were beginning to take root. The Carter family had downsized to a modest suburban home, much to the surprise of their former social circle. David and Claire had embraced their new lifestyle, finding joy in simpler pleasures and stronger family connections. At work, David had been relentless in his pursuit of a more ethical and community-focused approach to business. It hadn't been easy. He'd faced resistance from board members and shareholders alike. But slowly, surely, he was making progress. Today marked a significant milestone in David's journey. The company was hosting a large charity gala to launch its new community investment initiative, a program David had fought hard to establish. The event was to be held in the very park where David had found himself after losing his memory. As David adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, Claire appeared behind him, a smile on her face. "Ready for your big night?" she asked, straightening his collar. David took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." There's a lot riding on this event. The gala was in full swing when David and Claire arrived. The once neglected park had been transformed into an elegant venue with strung between trees and beautifully decorated tables scattered across the lawn. David couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he saw his two worlds blending seamlessly. As they mingled with the guests, David was approached by Robert, his former adversary on the board. "I have to hand it to you, Carter," Robert said, his tone a mix of admiration and lingering skepticism. "When you first proposed this initiative, I thought you'd lost your mind, but the numbers don't lie. Our community investments are already showing returns, both financially and in terms of public goodwill." David smiled, feeling a sense of vindication. "Thanks, Robert. I'm glad you're seeing the benefits. This is just the beginning." As the evening progressed, David took to the stage to give his keynote speech. Looking out over the crowd, he saw faces from every part of his journey: corporate executives, community members, and his friends from the park restoration project. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice strong and clear, "tonight we're not just launching a new initiative, we're embracing a new way of doing business. One that recognizes that true success isn't measured solely by profit margins, but by the positive impact we have on our communities and the world around us." As David continued his speech, outlining the company's plans for community investment and sustainable practices, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd experienced in his old life. This was what he had been missing, the void he had tried to fill with material success. Suddenly, Claire appeared at the side of the stage, her face pale and urgent. She gestured for David to come over immediately. Confused and concerned, David quickly wrapped up his speech and hurried to his wife's side. "Claire, what's wrong?" he asked, worry evident in his voice. Claire's eyes were wide with a mix of emotions: fear, anger, and disbelief. "David, I just got a call from our lawyer. There's a problem, a big one." She pulled out her phone and showed David a video that was rapidly circulating online. It showed Claire, months ago, in a heated argument with someone. The audio was clear. "I don't care what it takes. Make sure David doesn't remember anything about the company's offshore accounts. We can't risk him exposing everything we've worked for." David felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. He stared at Claire, unable to process what he was seeing and hearing. "Claire, what is this? What have you done?" Claire's composure crumbled. "I'm so sorry, David. When you had your accident, I panicked. The company was involved in some questionable practices, things you had reservations about, but the board pushed through. When you lost your memory, I saw it as an opportunity to protect us, to protect everything we'd built. The world seemed to spin around David. Everything he thought he knew, everything he'd been working towards, suddenly felt like it was built on a lie. He looked out at the gala, at all the people celebrating the company's new ethical direction, and felt a wave of nausea. As security personnel began to approach, alerted by the commotion, David made a split-second decision. He turned to Claire, his voice low and urgent. "We need to tell the truth, all of it, right now." Before Claire could respond, David strode back to the microphone. The crowd, sensing something was amiss, fell into an uneasy silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice shaking slightly, "I stand before you tonight not as a successful businessman or a pillar of the community, but as a man who has just learned a difficult truth." Over the next few minutes, David laid bare everything: the company's unethical practices, Claire's deception, and his own unknowing complicity. As he spoke, he could see the shock and disappointment spreading through the crowd. But he also saw something else, a glimmer of respect for his honesty. As David finished his confession, the park erupted into chaos. Reporters clamored for more information, executives huddled in urgent discussions, and David's friends from his amnesiac days looked on with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. In the midst of the tumult, David felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Tom, his eyes filled with understanding. "You did the right thing, David. It won't be easy, but it's the only way forward." As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, David realized that his journey of self-discovery was far from over. He had lost his memory once and found a new purpose. Now, faced with the harsh truth of his past, he would have to find the strength to rebuild once again. This time with his eyes wide open to both the challenges and the opportunities that lay ahead. The gala, meant to celebrate a new beginning, had instead become the starting point of an even more profound transformation. As David stood amidst the chaos, he knew that the real work, the work of genuine redemption and lasting change, was only just beginning.